Hi, everyone. I'm Thérèse, and this is New York Girl Again, The After, the podcast for caregivers who have survived the hardest chapter of their lives and are now gathering both the courage and the strength to write the next one. This month, we're continuing our Women and Caregiving series. So far, we have talked about what happens when caregiving ends and the identity disruption that follows. This week, I wanted to take a deeper dive because there's a question underneath almost every caregiving story. Why do so many women put themselves last, even when it costs them their health, their identity, and sometimes their future? So let's start with some data. As I've already mentioned, according to the 2025 AARP and National Alliance for Caregiving report, there are now 63 million caregivers in the United States. That's nearly 1 in every 4 adults. And about 61% of them are women. But here's what matters more. That same research shows women are more likely to provide more hours of care, provide higher intensity care, take on more complex medical and coordination tasks, and experience greater emotional and physical strain. So this isn't just anecdotal. This is a documented pattern, and it's consistent across large national data sets. So this pattern, women stepping in, taking on more, and staying longer, is not random. And I can tell you, this pattern isn't just something I've read about. It's something I've lived. When my mom needed care, I stepped in. When my uncle needed care, I stepped in. I was part of a big family, one of 7 siblings, one of 4 nieces. But over time, I became the one who took on most of the caregiving responsibility. There was never a formal decision. It just happened. And like so many women do, I accepted it. I stepped forward and I stayed. And then came the final chapter, caring for my dad. And that was different. There was no sharing that responsibility, no rotation, no stepping away for any kind of respite. It was just me, completely responsible for his care, his safety, his life. And there's something that happens when you carry that level of responsibility for another human being. You don't just give your time. You give yourself. And that doesn't just affect you during caregiving. It follows you into the after. There's a concept in psychology called role engulfment. It describes what happens when one role becomes so dominant, it begins to define your identity, your entire sense of self. And caregiving is one of the strongest environments for that to happen. Because caregiving is tied to love, responsibility, and often life or death stakes. So over time, your brain begins to link I am needed with I matter. And when that link forms, something shifts internally. You stop organizing your life around yourself and start organizing it entirely around someone else. You stop asking, what do I need? And start living from, what do they need? It doesn't always happen consciously, but instead neurologically and behaviorally. This is supported by psychological research on identity and caregiving, showing that long-term caregivers often experience identity shifts where self-worth becomes tied to caregiving performance. So why does this happen? From a behavioral psychology standpoint, caregiving creates what's called a reinforcement loop. Every time you solve a problem, ease someone else's pain, or prevent a crisis, your brain receives powerful reinforcement, relief, purpose, meaning, a sense of accomplishment, and often love. And reinforcement is what wires behavior. So over time, caregiving stops feeling like something you choose. It becomes something you just do, something you feel responsible for maintaining, something your brain begins to prioritize automatically. And that's why so many caregivers don't just help, they overextend, they overfunction. They anticipate needs before they arise. They remove their own needs without even realizing it. Because that pattern has been reinforced over and over again. For me, this wasn't a short season. Caregiving shaped most of my adult life. I planned my days off, my weekends, even my energy around check-ins and visits to my parents and my uncle. And there were opportunities I had to walk away from. Before I became a nurse, and I was working in the corporate arena, I was being considered for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to work in Ireland for a year. And I couldn't go because I couldn't be that far away for that long. And later, when I was caring for my dad, I had to limit my work as an RN, which dramatically impacted my income and disqualified me from my employer's health insurance. And when I look back now, I can see how very much I quietly gave up. Not because anyone forced me to, but because the role had become so deeply wired into me that I really didn't see another option. There is also a biological reality, and it affects women in a very real way. Research has shown that long-term caregiving is associated with chronic stress activation, including elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep, and increased risk of both depression and physical health decline. But here's where it becomes especially important for women. Studies have found that women caregivers report higher levels of stress, anxiety, and emotional strain than men, even when providing similar levels of care. And part of that is because women don't just carry the physical responsibilities of caregiving. They carry the emotional and mental load. They are more likely to be the ones anticipating needs, the ones tracking every detail, the ones managing the emotional environment of the entire family. So the stress isn't just about what they do. It's about what they are constantly holding in their minds and bodies. And over time, the nervous system adapts to that. It becomes wired for vigilance, for responsibility, for don't drop the ball. So even when someone says, take a break, go take care of yourself, for many women, that doesn't feel like relief. It feels like risk. It feels like something important might fall apart. And then what? There's also another layer here. Women disproportionately carry what researchers call emotional labor. Not just completing tasks, but managing relationships, emotions, tension, expectations, and the overall sense of stability for everyone involved. It's not just what you do, it's what you are constantly thinking about. Who needs to be called? Who is struggling emotionally? What hasn't been said but is felt? What might happen next? It's the mental tracking of everything and everyone. And that creates a level of cognitive and emotional load that most people don't see. In fact, recent research in 2025 on what's now being called the mental load gap shows that women are significantly more likely to carry the ongoing responsibility of organizing, anticipating, and emotionally managing daily life, even when others are present and helping. Meaning, even when you're not physically doing something, your mind never turns off. And emotionally, that has a cost. Because you're not just responding to what's happening, you're holding anticipatory stress, unspoken worry, emotional responsibility for others, and often the pressure to keep everything from falling apart. So when caregiving begins, women don't just step into a role. They absorb the entire system, the logistics, the emotions, the stability. And over time, that creates a kind of exhaustion that goes beyond physical fatigue. It's mental. It's emotional. It's the feeling of never fully being able to put anything down. I remember being constantly on guard, especially during the last chapter of caring for my dad. I wasn't just worried about his safety or his health. It went even deeper than that. I was pouring so much of my time and energy into protecting his dignity, into preserving his independence for as long as I possibly could, because I knew how very much that meant to him. And that kind of responsibility, it never really lets you rest. Not your mind, not your heart. Caregivers know that it's not just that you were doing everything. It's that you were carrying everything. This has real consequences. The 2025 Caregiving in the U.S. report found that 50% of caregivers experience financial strain. Many take on debt, and 7 in 10 caregivers have their work disrupted. And when you look specifically at women, the impact becomes even more pronounced. Other workforce research shows women are significantly more likely to reduce their hours, more likely to step out of the workforce entirely, and in some studies, up to 5 times more likely than men to leave their jobs because of caregiving. As I mentioned earlier, I was one of these statistics. I made decisions around work, around opportunity, around my future, not based on what I wanted, but based on what was needed for my loved ones. And that's something many women don't talk about openly, because it doesn't feel like a choice at the time. It feels like responsibility. It feels like love. But the deepest cost isn't financial. It's internal. What researchers and clinicians describe as identity constriction. Your world becomes smaller. Your time becomes smaller. Your sense of self becomes smaller. Your life begins to revolve around appointments, medications, symptoms, schedules, survival. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the parts of you that once existed outside of caregiving, your interests, your independence, your future plans, get pushed further and further into the background until one day the question isn't just, what do I do now? It becomes, who am I now? And this is the part that matters so much, because everything we just described, the self-sacrifice, the overfunctioning, the loss of self-focus, it was adaptation. You adapted to an environment that required constant awareness, high responsibility, emotional endurance, and often decision-making under pressure. You adapted to being the one people relied on, the one who noticed everything, the one who stepped in when something needed to be done. And over time, that adaptation becomes automatic. It became your baseline, your default, not because you lacked boundaries, but because the situation you were in didn't allow for them. And there's something else that's important to say here. That level of adaptation is not something everyone can do. It requires resilience, emotional strength, endurance, and a capacity to hold more than most people ever have to carry. And you did that. You showed up again and again, even when you were exhausted, even when you felt like you had nothing left. You adapted, and you did it well. But here's the turning point. When caregiving ends, everything changes. The appointments stop. The constant monitoring stops. The role that structured your entire life stops. But what doesn't stop is how your mind has been conditioned to function. Because the patterns that helped someone you love survive don't just disappear the moment caregiving ends. You are still wired to anticipate, to monitor, to prioritize someone else, to stay on high alert, even when there is no longer a crisis to manage. And that's where so many women find themselves in the after. The world looks at you and thinks, you're free now. You can move on. But internally, nothing feels clear. Because in the after, the story has changed, but your conditioning hasn't yet. And that creates a kind of disorientation that's hard to explain. You're no longer needed in the same way, but you haven't yet reconnected with yourself. And now the question isn't just, what do I do next? It becomes, how do I begin to build a life again after mine was shaped around someone else's for so long? Once you understand all of this, that the way you lived, the way you showed up, the way you put yourself last was shaped by conditioning, reinforced over time, wired into your body, and expected of you, something begins to shift. Because now you can see it for what it really was. It wasn't that you didn't value yourself. It's that you were caring for someone you loved in a way that required almost everything you had. And for many of us, we would do it again. Because it mattered. They mattered. But caregiving was a chapter. A powerful one. A defining one. but it was still a chapter. And the way you had to function inside that chapter, constantly giving, constantly anticipating, constantly putting yourself last, was never meant to be how you live for the rest of your life. And this is where the shift begins. Not by rejecting who you were as a caregiver, but by honoring it and then gently allowing something new to emerge. Because you don't stop being someone who loves deeply. You don't stop being someone who shows up. You don't stop being someone who would carry the people you love if you had to. But now, you begin to include yourself in that same level of care. Your health, your life, your future. Not as an afterthought, but as something that matters too. Caregiving asked everything of you. The after is where you begin to make space for yourself again. I'm Thérèse, and this is New York Girl Again, the after. For those learning how to live, feel, and become themselves again after caregiving. And wherever you are in your journey, I'm so glad you're here.